Hello, and welcome everyone to the second event in the three-part series, Conversations in Contemplative Psychotherapy, Deepening Personal and Social Transformation, which has been organized by the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science and Tricycle. I'm Fiona Brandon. I'm one of the directors of the Nalanda Institute's Contemplative Psychotherapy program, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And it's inspiring to have such a large group of folks who are joining today who are inspired to learn more about contemplative psychotherapy. So the intention of the summit is to bring curiosity and dialogue to the ways in which contemplative science and practices can address individual, social, and cultural dimensions of suffering and promote individual and collective health and well-being, emphasizing social safety, emotional connectiveness, group belonging, and creativity. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, this series draws upon the curriculum and the faculty of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science Psychotherapy program, and as well as what we've learned over the last 10 years from offering this unique program. Our hope is to raise more awareness about this highly promising field and its breakthroughs, and to share with you some of the wisdom of some of the contributors to the upcoming second edition of our book, Advances in Contemplative Psychotherapy, that will be published by Routledge in June. Last week, our founder, Joe Luizzo, explored personal and social healing through mindfulness and loving kindness with a group of panelists. And today we're going to build on that discussion by looking at interpersonal and social healing through wise compassion. So today we're really going to be focusing on compassion. Rick Hanson will give our keynote talk on compassion science in psychotherapy and global well-being. And then we'll open up the discussion to include our other panelists, Doris, Chang, and Sheryl Petty. And we would very much like to answer questions from the audience. So please put questions in the Q&A, and we'll have time towards the end of our time together to share them with the panelists. Okay, so now let me introduce Rick Hanson, neuropsychologist, teacher, New York Times bestselling author, and the founder of the Global Compassion Coalition. He's a co-founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, and is a senior fellow of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. He's written a number of books on self-directed neuroplasticity, including Buddha's Brain and Hardwiring Happiness. So Rick, you've devoted 4 decades to integrating meditation, brain research, and clinical psychology. And I'm very curious to hear how you're going to set the stage for today's discussion on healing through wise compassion. I'll take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Fiona. And what a long, strange trip it's been, right? I'm looking forward also to this panel with Sheryl and Doris and you. And I hope to talk with you all here briefly about confluences coming together of compassion science and compassionate practices in psychotherapy, healthcare, and society. And I'll refer to some research studies, and in the materials that you'll get after this program, we'll send you a summary document that has the citations for what I'm going to be talking about here. If neuroscience is a baby science compared to, say, astronomy or chemistry, compassion science is a newborn. We have a long way to go, but already there are significant findings with many implications for personal practice, interventions in the helping professions, and in education and business, and for society as a whole. These research findings refer to states and traits of compassion, including compassion for oneself, self-compassion, as well as different trainings in compassion and self-compassion. For simplicity and speed here and efficiency, I won't differentiate those details. Okay, so here we go. 4 major headlines so far. Number 1, compassion promotes healthy physiological regulation. For example, it improves functioning of the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. It lowers stress reactivity to anticipated pain, and compassion improves metabolic regulation, including among people with type 1 diabetes. Second key point, compassion lowers psychological distress and dysfunction in a variety of ways. It protects against depressed mood. It reduces the severity of PTSD symptoms. One of our focuses here will be about compassion and trauma. And related to that, compassion reduces trauma-related shame. It lowers anxiety. It improves motivation to improve during treatment, which is really important. You may know the kind of joke among therapists, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. So the wanting to change, right, is fueled in part by compassion and compassion for oneself. Compassion also reduces burnout among teachers and medical professionals, and it reduces body weight shame. Number 3, compassion promotes psychological resilience and well-being. It increases happiness and well-being, and it even supports positive aging. Headline number 4, compassion increases prosocial motivations, experiences, and actions. It promotes positive connections with others. It improves cooperation between patients and professionals in healthcare settings, and it expands a person's moral circle. Also, a topic very close to my own heart, having been married for 40 years now and raising 2 children to adulthood with my wife, compassion increases positive parenting practices. All right. And remember, I'm going to send you out, or they'll send you out a summary of those various citations for all that stuff. In addition to these general effects of compassion, some clinical interventions, some therapies have compassion right at their center. To use one example that's been well studied, compassion-focused therapy has been shown to be effective for mood disorders, especially those who are high in shame or self-criticism, often related to a trauma history. Compassion-focused therapy is also helpful with so-called difficult-to-treat groups, such as people in prison or who have an eating disorder or a personality disorder. This is all really pretty amazing, right? Something as near and dear to us, as heartfelt and as simple and so human, the heart of being human, as that empathic sense of suffering with a movement of concern and care toward it, can have so many benefits. Pretty great. And as is natural in any evolving field, certainly in the social sciences, there are both developing understandings of compassion and widening applications of it. And these are some of the topics we might get into in our panel. In terms of understandings of compassion, let's consider 3 key questions. Number 1, is compassion primarily a feeling or a motivation? For example, in the Buddhist traditions, compassion is commonly described as the wish, which is a motivation, that beings not suffer, while kindness is described as the wish that they be happy. Compassion presupposes suffering. Kindness may encompass a response to suffering, but it does not necessarily need to do so. But what about experiences in which there is the empathic recognition of suffering, along with warm-hearted concern, but there's no capacity either to relieve the suffering or to change its causes? In other words, there's no functional basis for motivation. Is there still compassion? Or consider situations in which a person could relieve the suffering and or change its causes, but chooses not to do so, such as deciding to use a finite amount of money to support a different charity. Now, in these kinds of experiences or situations, which seem quite common, don't they? Perhaps the motivational aspect is implicit. such as in the early neurological studies of Tibetan monks who were evoking boundless compassion, non-referential compassion inside an fMRI banging away. So it's helpful to have some stability of practice to be able to do that. And meanwhile, as they were extending boundless compassion in all directions, preparatory motor action regions in their brains began to show increased metabolic activity. There was nothing that could actually do inside the scanner, but they were getting ready to help if they could. So that's a really interesting question. Is compassion primarily an emotion or a motivation or both? Are there inherent necessary elements of compassion? What do we mean when we say be compassionate? Question number 2, does the full expression of compassion require addressing the causes of suffering? For example, if someone is suffering from hunger today, compassion could move you to feed them. But if you know that they will be hungry again tomorrow because of corruption in food distribution systems or other structural factors, wouldn't compassion move us to change that corruption if we could? More broadly, wouldn't compassion move us to change overall systemic forms of injustice that cause so much human suffering? And yet, historically, it hasn't much. We've had major religions with compassion at their heart for thousands of years that have generally avoided challenging systemic structural sources of suffering. Do we need to add a principled commitment to justice, including aspects of equity, inclusion, respect for diversity, and even reparations for the countless trillions of dollars stolen through slavery and colonialism, let alone the theft of the lands of Native people? Do we need to add that principle of justice alongside compassion in order to really effectively address systemic sources of suffering? And then question number 3, is compassion best framed individually or collectively? Most studies of compassion in Western countries approach it individualistically as something I experience toward a separate you. But as I am learning, in many other cultures, such as in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa probably, compassion arises in the context of what's sometimes called Ubuntu. I am because you are. In this we frame, there is a natural movement to relieve suffering since we are joined together, much as the right hand and the left hand are joined in a single body. So of course, one hand naturally reaches to hold the other hand if it is injured. In these cultural contexts, Western individualistic accounts of compassion and trainings in it can seem peculiar, if not jarring. And in general, this more collective we frame of compassion lends itself naturally to a movement toward, of course, challenging systemic sources of suffering, since no one in the we has the privilege of avoiding them. Moving on now to applications, broadening applications of compassion. Compassion-centered values, sometimes described in other ways, are increasingly common in business, such as concerns for the triple bottom line, or the growing interest in a well-being economy. They are also appearing in politics, such as the Compassionate Cities movement fostered by the Charter for Compassion, or new statutory requirements in the United Kingdom that potential laws need to report their impact on vulnerable groups. We find these values increasingly in sports, such as the 4 core values of the world champion Golden State Warriors. Go Dubs. Joy, mindfulness, compassion, and competition. And there is a growing recognition of the interdependence of humanity and nature, with compassion for the suffering of non-human animals, all sentient beings, and an appreciation for the deeply embedded wisdom of the First Nations people across the world. Meanwhile, new studies in anthropology and evolutionary neuropsychology are charting the biological evolution of compassion in ways that fully support its return, its long overdue return, to the heart of global society. All primate species, and there are hundreds of them, except one, live together on the basis of what's called holding and controlling. In other words, alphas, quote unquote, hold on to food and control reproduction. But during several million years of living in small bands while developing larger and more social brains, the brain has nearly tripled in size since our hominid ancestors first began manufacturing stone tools roughly 2.5 million years ago. During this long period of time, the human species evolved a unique way of living together that Professor Paul Gilbert has called caring and sharing. In other words, compassion and justice. It wasn't perfect, of course, and holding and controlling, callousness and cruelty, were commonly unleashed on other hunter-gatherer bands in the struggle for scarce resources. But inside the band, these were constrained. It's really remarkable to appreciate the simple fact that compassion and justice were the foundation of social life for 97% of the time our species has walked this earth over the past 300,000 years. Compassion and justice were the foundation of healthy human politics, making cooperative decisions, regulating power, sharing resources, and protecting and caring for those who are vulnerable. But with the surpluses and larger populations enabled by agriculture, the primitive strategy of holding and controlling returned and became the dominant form of societal organization for the past 10,000 years or so. And with some exceptions, it's been kind of Game of Thrones ever since. What worked in our small bands was for the many to join together to regulate the powerful few. But for thousands of years now, under the thumb or the boot of various chieftains, warlords, aristocrats, and kings, this was generally impossible. But now, with multiple positive developments, such as science, pockets of civil society, labor movements, global communications, a rising middle class, empowerment of women with still a long way to go, and youth around the world increasingly dissatisfied with business as usual, new coalitions, people joining together in common cause, much as our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, are forming within countries and across national boundaries. One of these, as Joe mentioned at the very beginning, or Fiona as well, one of these is the Global Compassion Coalition, which I've started with friends and colleagues from around the world, such as Joe Loizzo and other distinguished individuals and organizations. We're creating a new kind of global commons in which millions of people can come together to be big enough, to be strong enough, to overcome entrenched forces of wealth and power and produce systemic changes for the greater good, such as for the climate crisis and for children and families. To learn more, just go to globalcompassioncoalition.org, and I hope you will join us. It doesn't cost anything, there's no obligation, and as I've said, the more people we are, the stronger we are for the common good. Everywhere around us, I see both a sense of outrage and often despair. People can feel helpless, but we can learn from what worked for our ancestors and turn despair into determination and hope by coming together as we are in this gathering here. Several hundred people here are coming together, and we can come together at larger scales with more and more individuals and organizations to listen to and learn from each other, to stand up with and stand up for each other and build a much, much better world. May it be so, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that just really thorough and thoughtful overview of compassion science as it is currently. Thank you so much. And I'm eager to get our other panelists in on the conversation as well. So let me begin by introducing Sheryl Petty. She is an organizational development and systems change consultant. Her work for nearly 30 years supports the healing and healthy functioning of organizations to embody deep equity, including supporting individuals, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, government agencies, and universities. She is ordained as a Nakma and teaches in the Nyingma lineage of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism
Hmm.
and has been a Yoruba priest since 1997. She's authorized to share practices based in Bon Buddhist Dokten. She also has been a principal associate at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University, a fellow at Stanford's Center for Opportunity, Policy, and Education, and was adjunct faculty at Teachers College, Columbia University. And currently she is a fellow with the Mind and Life Institute. So welcome, Sheryl. Thank you so much for being here. And let me bring in Doris as well. So Doris Chang is Associate Professor at the New York University Silver School of Social Work and a co-investigator at the Center of Excellence for Cultural Competence, New York State Psychiatric Institute. She's a clinical psychologist by training and completed an NIMH postdoctoral fellowship in medical anthropology at the Department of Social Science, Harvard Medical School. And much of Dr. Chang's work has centered on issues facing Asian American communities, most recently examining Asian Americans' experience of discrimination since COVID-19 pandemic, and the role that critical consciousness, solidarity, and allyship with other BIPOC communities may promote resilience. So welcome, Doris and Sheryl, to our conversation. Thought I would kick things off with you, Doris. And I thought to pick up on the thread that Rick introduced around compassion and justice. And Doris is someone who trains social workers on cultural competency and researches discrimination facing Asian American community. I'm curious, what your experience and how you would describe the benefits of contemplative compassion in the realm of psychotherapy and creating an anti-discrimination worldview. Thoughts around compassion and justice in the work that you do.
Thank you so much. Just to start off, thank you, Rick, for those really thought-provoking comments and for providing such a rich context for us to have this conversation in. And thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. Really excited to be here. I guess in my experience in the different spaces I've been in, I have come to see compassion training as actually a really important tool, because the reality is, like, those of us, if we take a moment to tune into ourselves, we recognize that compassion is something that comes more easily to us when we think about certain groups compared to other groups. And we see how this plays out in systems, in all institutional, spaces. Power is very much embedded into, the idea of compassion. Like who should we hope we can alleviate suffering for? Whose suffering are we privileging as important to intervene in? And one thing that I have found in terms of training social workers, training psychologists, training educators, is when we recognize that aspect in ourselves, that we find it's easier to be compassionate of some groups rather than others. It often makes us feel pretty bad. Those of us engaged in the helping professions, we want to think of ourselves as someone who is equitable in terms of this positive pro-social emotion. And yet we recognize that that's not always the case. This is where bias comes in our socialization and the ways in which we're separated from each other in society. And so I always tell my students and folks I work with that the good news is that compassion is something we can cultivate. And I think that that's where these practices are so powerful and provides so much hope to us as a society, that we don't have to accept the fact that there's ways in which our hearts are hardened towards certain groups, that if our intentions and our values are in the realm of social justice, we can work with our inner resistance and our inner biases through these really powerful practices.
Thank you, Doris. Right. So I'm curious to sort of build upon what Doris has just shared. And I'm wondering, Sheryl, if you're open to jumping in and just in the realms in which you work, with larger organizations, educational institutions. I'm wondering if you can extend on what Doris has shared, but maybe talk also a little bit more about resilience. Like, how is compassion a piece to help resilience in the work that you do in organizations?
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. And thank you to my colleagues. Happy to be here. I so wish I could see these nearly 300 faces, at least quickly. I wish I could see you all. I use the word stamina a lot lately. I know folks use the word resilience a lot, but this comes up in my work frequently. So I often work with organizations who are in some state of distress at a full institutional level. Now, human beings are everywhere. We all know the things that go on behind the scenes in organizations, and I have the honor and privilege of supporting untangling of knots in institutional systems. So there's untangling of knots in our bodies, there's untangling of knots between us interpersonally, and there's untangling of knots institutionally, and then there's untangling of knots societally. A lot of my work supports sort of smoothing that out. If you think of a cloth when it's all bunched up, knotted up, as opposed to when the cloth is smoothed out. To me, and in my practice and experience, both with organizations and spiritually, what we say is our natural goodness flows, right? When there's not a kink in the hose, the water will flow, right? We all know this. This is the same thing. So, this, whether you call it stamina, whether you call it resilience, what we're looking to do, a lot of what I see is to reconnect with what's been shunted because they're not inside of us and inside of our systems, and then building the stamina to stay present with that once the flow reawakens, right? Things will atrophy, right? If we don't use it, things will start to, we get gunk that clogs the system, right, inside of ourselves. And so, this notion of how do we unnumb and become feeling inside of here, feeling amongst one another, and able to actually be sensitive and sensitized to the suffering around us and our own. This is a lot of what I see. And again, it doesn't seem to matter. It seems to be irrelevant in my experience, whether we're talking about individual people and bodies, or whether we're talking about larger bodies that are institutional or societal. There's something about this unkinking the knot so that we can allow our natural goodness to flow. And then this, whether you call it right action, compassionate action, that will automatically happen. We can't help ourselves because of the open-heartedness that results from that. So we could say 97,100,000 things, but I'll pause there.
Wonderful. I mean, I really appreciate, Sheryl, you bringing in this notion of tolerating when the flow is actually opened, right? And how do we meet that? And so I'm curious, maybe Rick or anyone else, Rick, but maybe if you want to jump in and just in terms of your work, as a neuropsychologist, can you, help us understand what you've seen in terms of helping folk to be able to tolerate this flow that Sheryl's introduced?
This is really rich already. Just really briefly, there was a recent study, I don't have the citation, that really struck me, which spoke to the ways in which compassion is bittersweet. There is the bitter of the openness to the suffering. You let other people land. And I really appreciated also what you said there a moment ago, Doris, about expanding the circle and becoming increasingly mindful of who you're leaving out, right? I think of Ta-Nehisi Coates' definition of privilege in part as what we don't have to take into account, who we get to leave out, and becoming more mindful. And in other words, not leaving out the fact that we're leaving people out, leaving groups of people, leaving forces out, and expanding our capacity to recognize that. So to be able to tolerate that, to be able to tolerate guilt, shame, moral weight, as well as to simply tolerate the empathy for the suffering, including the suffering inside yourself, it's remarkable that with that bitter, let's say, is also the sweet of activation of reward systems in the brain that are associated with the lovingness, the concern, the caring. Caring is affectively positive, right? The kindness, the wish that they do better, as it moves through you, it's protective and rewarding. That's why there's empathy burnout, but there's actually not compassion burnout, because we're protected and nourished by that caringness and lovingness flowing through. That's why it's really important to be able to sustain the flow through the kinks. I'm imagining my garden hose right now and the kinks that can occur. To be able to tolerate that and to open up to that, it's really helpful to keep returning to the warm-heartedness. That's such an important aspect of compassionate concern.
Might I just offer a rephrase of the word tolerate? There's something about it that the word that we use in some spiritual traditions is stay present with. And I would prefer that one. Because I don't know, there's a more positive connotation to it for me, that something's happening with, like when the current is running through the circuit, we've got to build up. What was the phrase you just used? Expanding our capacity. Yes, this becomes the function of practice. First you open, and then you expand the capacity to remain present with that openness.
But I'm curious, because in my work as a psychotherapist, I offer with my clients, there can be quite a resistance to this warm-heartedness, Rick, that you're talking about. And I'm curious, how do you engage and help folks to cultivate that warm-heartedness, whether it's with clients or with larger institutions, right? How do you help folks to embrace the return to the warm-heartedness?
Probably a great question for all of us. Just personally, as a longtime therapist, I see two things. One is that sometimes when people get in touch with that warm-heartedness, it activates very strong and understandable longings to receive caring, rooted in their attachment history, and which then in their history are associated with pain or the expectation of pain. So they shut down the connectedness and the warm-heartedness, understandably, to prevent the pain that they actually encountered when they were young and now anticipate often semi-consciously or even unconsciously today. That's one. And then second, sometimes with that warm-heartedness comes a feeling of moral burden, obligation, responsibility. And there too, if they belong to a group of people and that has been told many times that they're responsible for the welfare of others, to the loss of their own welfare even, then it also can become problematic to open up to that warm-heartedness, as well as for more individual reasons. So I'll just introduce that, but I'm really interested in Doris and Sheryl, what you would say about this. Really provocative question.
What's coming to mind for me is well, first of all, I love what you said, Rick, but and I'm also thinking that the struggle I've seen more from folks is the resistance to actually directing self-compassion and cultivating self-compassion. And that seems, I've been struck by how difficult, how it's more difficult for a lot of people that I know, who are especially folks who see themselves as committed to social justice, are engaged in the helping professions, that cultivating self-compassion is more painful. actually. And I think it comes from, some of the things that you've addressed, Rick, and also a sense of like, I'm not deserving of it. My function and my identity are built around the extent to which I can alleviate others' suffering. People look to me for that. And it's hard. It's really, really hard to see oneself as deserving of that same kind of care and love. And it does elicit those feelings of longing. And at the same time, it challenges, it connects us to a feeling of vulnerability. It's much easier to say, like, I have capacity to give to others than it is to acknowledge that we also are in need of those same kinds of care.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. And Doris, you use this word deserving. I was thinking about that earlier today, even when we were doing our prep call, this notion of deserving, especially for, in my experience, communities who've experienced long-term oppression and maybe internalized that, right? This sort of martyr syndrome that we can get into. It's like this badge of, our ability to give and give and give and give. And yet we all know this metaphor, right, about putting on your own mask before helping others. Right? How can I be able to give somehow the notion of burnout, if we're depleting our own reservoirs, right, and not replenishing them? At some point, that thing is going to go to zero. I mean, at some point, it's going to lay us out. And I can't tell you how many people I talk to on a weekly basis, if not daily, including myself, where at some point, even our body will start talking to us. Things will stop working the way that we expect them to work physiologically. All kinds of illnesses will come up for people. Long lists of things that I can think of from this notion of overgiving. And for many people, it seems selfish rather than nourishment. And sometimes I'll ask the clients, I do a lot of coaching for individuals in addition to organizations. And I'll say things like, well, what would you want for your own children? What would you want for the people that you're supervising? And for them, it's easy for them to say, oh, I want them to be nourished. I want them to love themselves. And I'm like, okay, turn that around to yourself. And you're right, there's this moment of, how can I, this cognitive dissonance, how can I want this for these people that I love and not want it for this person? Is fascinating when we do that. And I really want to say we, because, I have to counsel Sheryl about these things.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing in the personal, Sheryl, in this regard. And I'm curious if any of you are willing to share, from your personal experience of practicing compassion practices over time, have you experienced any surprises or sort of unforeseen, moments from this practice, whether it's towards yourself in a situation or towards others in a situation, that you said, yeah, that experience just happened, or I did it that way that surprised me. And I know that came from my compassion practices. I don't know if anything comes to mind in that realm.
Yes, but I'm making space.
I mean, for me personally, and I appreciate you asking us about our personal experiences with these practices. For me, it has broken up almost the desire for there to be a binary between, good and bad. Who are the people that are like on the side of justice, and those are the people who are against justice. And there's a desire for us who work in these spaces to like see it that clearly. And I think the compassion practices for me have softened my judgments towards others and allowed me, forced me to see things as more complex. And, because I'm really engaged in this process of trying to put myself in another person's shoes, that sort of perspective taking skill that comes from these practices And so there's been a muddying of the waters in some respects that has allowed me to actually feel more connected to people who I actually feel, quite in opposition to in a lot of respects. But I think what it does is it allows me to see like a third path, or find points of connection. And that's actually made me more effective. And in terms of being able to build bridges, which I think is core to this work, if we're talking about social justice work, that's an essential skill.
Thank you, Doris. Sheryl, you had a thought.
I want to hear Rick. First.
Making space too. Well, I'm feeling and reflecting on the connection, building on something both of you have said, the connection between individual marginalization or leaving out and collective marginalization and leaving out at different scales. And I'm just reflecting on the ways in which collective processes of dismissiveness, pushing aside, leaving out, not having to take it into account, are connected in various ways to what we leave out or push away or deny or shame, etc., inside ourselves. And then personally, I find for me a lot of the value of compassion for myself, and it might even maybe enable me to be more compassionate for others, is to include more and more of the parts of myself that give me the willies, that are locked away or scary or I'm ashamed of or I have just tuned out, etc. And one form that's taken, and I can think of a very particular example, is around self-forgiveness. Compassion has many friends, and compassion is a friend to many good things. And I found myself once being really upset with someone who'd mistreated me, and genuinely, and I was going through a process of forgiving them, but I couldn't really get free of it until I looked at what there was to forgive in myself, that including various things. I had to include them. And bring them in with that quality of clear seeing. Compassion sees clearly. Compassion is independent. Getting to what you said earlier there, Doris, obviously compassion is independent of approval. In principle, we can have compassion for people we disapprove of or disagree with or think are the source of their own suffering. Compassion fundamentally is independent of all that, although often we're very dragged down those roads, as you know, of leaving out people in our circle of compassionate care. Anyway, so I'll just maybe finish there, just mentioning for myself at least, a response to your question, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Really, really similar, Doris, to what you've shared. I mean, the word that occurred to me when Fiona first asked the question was this notion of boundlessness. Boundless, just the sensation of that love feels better than cringing. That actually feeling and I'm talking sort of this boundless care. In my own experience, like that is what results. There's this saying, I don't know if it's from Zen or another system, that the moon shines equally on all. Right? It's not, it doesn't have preferences. It's not like, yes, you get the light and you don't get anything. But yeah, my own personal experience is really just this sense of everyone is here. Everyone is welcome here in my heart. And it makes one very, you could say soft, supple, tender. That's the word I want, tender. Some of you may have read Zenju Earthland Manual's Awakening the Way of Tenderness. I'm getting the name of the book wrong, but she's fantastic. An incredible Zen priest. That's the feeling. And something Rick just said just brought up this word again that I mentioned earlier around, numbness or unnumbing, which I use a lot in work. But you said, Rick, leaving out. So when we're leaving out others or we're leaving out parts of ourselves, I mean, from my perspective, those are states of numbness, right? We're shunting something off. Oh, my foot is numb, or this part, I'm not looking over there. I'm not looking at that, la, 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 not that. And at the deeper levels of practice, the further that we go, our repertoire, right? Our repertoire to have that big, huge heart expands, and our ability to deal with intensity, those scary things, the drama, the extremely painful things happening in our own lives or that we are witnessing, our stamina deepens the deeper that we go into practice. And there's much that can be said about that. At the earlier stages, things can seem daunting. As we develop capacity in our repertoire, the more that we can deal with greater and greater intensity with skill and lovingness.
So, I mean, the three of you are really sharing the breadth of the benefits of compassion, and thank you for sharing, from your personal experience as well. And so, right, we're really naming how critical compassion is as a way, to be part of the human family, and for all of us to get along. And so, I'm wondering, any ideas around how we can extend the benefits of compassion practice to people of, diverse racial, gender, economic, and cultural backgrounds who might have limited access to the Dharma or limited access to mainstream psychotherapy, right? How can we extend, these ideas that we're talking about?
Well, I guess I just want to maybe complicate the question, Fiona, because I think that that's a really
Please.
good question. But also the fact I think that the research actually shows us that people who are from more marginalized aspects of society are actually naturally more compassionate than people with more power, right? So the question is really like, what can we learn from people who are, their compassion practices are organic and out of hardship and collective, right? And it's enacted every day through like the church potluck, or taking care of your child while you're at work, like all of these neighborhood practices that have come out of hardship and collective sharing in that hardship. So we see research that shows that, like, for example, the poor are much more empathic, give more money than people who are wealthy, right? So there is an inherent understanding of one's vulnerability and the importance of interdependence and the need to be there for one another, that I feel like for those of us who have more privilege and more power, we've lost. And Rick has shown us a little bit of that history. We've lost as a society. So, I just want to lean into recognizing that, rather than this sort of a top down, like, how can we bring this to the masses? How can we share it in having more of an equitable conversation about what we have to learn from each other about how to be more compassionate?
Thank you. Can I jump in? I mean, we're like this, we're like that. I mean, it's just, I was thinking about this earlier as well. It is often, it's often the case unconsciously, like this happens all the time unconsciously, that sometimes we'll think of a question or we'll frame a question, and it can be kind of deficit based, accidentally, unintentionally. There's sort of, how can we help them to have access to something, as opposed to the asset-based approach, which is like, what's there already? What wisdom and goodness and fruit and amazing, practices and approaches are there already that may not be recognizable from a dominant thinking mindset. I don't use the term West anymore because it implies that the West is a monolith. So I'm part of the West, but I'm part of many non-dominant communities that are often invisibilized or erased in that framing. So I tend to use terms like dominant and non-dominant. So to Doris's point, this sense of, when we become more privileged, sometimes our privilege can insulate us, and there's when the numbness happens. And when we are at the mercy of or by force sometimes really present to the elements, one another, just the sort of tides of life, we have to be sensitive because we have to know how to maneuver those really skillfully. Do you see what I'm saying? Like if it rains and you feel the rain, you're going to have a set of skills that you may not develop if you were insulated from the rain. Do you see what I'm saying? This is it. So it's the recognition of, to Doris's points, what are the compassion and wisdom practices that are already present among many non-dominant, marginalized, whatever the term, BIPOC, multi-identity communities that are usually not setting the table, but are invited to tables like this. Beloved colleagues.
Yeah, thank you for really turning my question, on its ear and bringing in, a view of how we need to really shift, and I need to shift, right, my framework of that question. I appreciate that so much, and I'm curious then maybe to extend on that. Do you have any folks or social justice movements in mind where you really see compassion in action, where are there folks that you might even qualify as like mentors or organizations that you really see embracing compassion and really effectively using it towards social justice?
I know we have really long lists, all of us. We all probably have such long lists. Who wants to start?
Go ahead and start, Sheryl.
Okay. I mean, I just feel like there's so many. I can't even, and hopefully folks will populate these in the chat, answering Fiona's question. Hopefully you will share these with one another. Those of you out there who are thinking of different entities. I mean, so many people know about John Powell and his work, and all of the folks who work with the Othering and Belonging Institute, and many of the organizations that he's worked with and founded. Adrienne Marie Brown, I feel like, is another manifestation in a way of fierce compassion from my perspective. Kara Page, who works more on the healing justice part of things, folks may know about. Taj James, who co-founded Movement Strategy Center and now founded another organization which really works in the philanthropic space around redistributing resources, I think is profound. Some folks might know Wendy Farley, who I cannot say enough about, who's at San Francisco Theological Seminary. Cannot say enough about her. Resmaa Menakem, my grandmother's hands. Need I say more? Someone could put him in the chat and get the spelling. Thank you. Folks are populating the chat a little bit. I'll pause there, but those are some of the folks who I think about, but the list is really, really long in this sort of healing justice space. And the one caution I would say before inviting my colleagues in here is, you know how folks have, maybe we can talk in a minute about this whole use of the term trauma informed. Just can we go there and the pros and cons of that? So I'm just going to put a pin in it as we answer Fiona's first question.
I'm just thinking about people who work in the critical consciousness space, because I think that, as we think about how we can develop more compassion for those who are the most vulnerable in our society, having a structural understanding of why people, are in positions that they're in, why people are poor, why people are sick, rather than sort of see them as just, just like bearing the fruits of their own decisions. Like having a sort of a critical awareness of structural oppression expands our compassion and desire to help. And so people who are working in this space in education, for example, NYU has a Center for Equity and Transformation of Schools, where they're doing a ton of incredible training and work. in New York City public schools and also nationally. And there is a movement to introduce mindfulness and other contemplative practices into schools as a way of building capacity. So I think people who work in those spaces in education are real heroes in this work.
Thank you, Doris.
Rick, did you want to add anybody in here?
I'm definitely on the learning team here, and the two that I've been very recently, introduced to, and I have a lot to learn. First of all, it's just the framing of compassion, which, as you point out, Sheryl, is so important to pay attention to that framing. The framing of compassion within the context of First Nations people around the world, who are obviously diverse, and so much learning there. I'm beginning in Braiding Sweetgrass as a book. I also wanted to mention, I put it in the chat, Mempela Rempeli, who's an historic figure from South Africa, very, very involved in that movement there, someone I've learned an enormous amount from. She has a listing in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you can look her up. That's another resource. She has really kind of radically recontextualized how I, as a longtime psychotherapist who works at it, and Buddhist teacher who tends to work at the individual level, she's really radically recontextualized my own framings and situatedness of compassionate experiences and actions.
I would just like to acknowledge, I don't know I don't know how thorough a response we can have. I just glanced at the chat, and there's a person, Sandra Lukic, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, who mentioned in their experience in an Eastern European country, a war-torn country, that folks who have their basic needs met are more compassionate, while those who are struggling economically are less. And me, as a person who only has US, like this is my only sort of living experience. I've never lived in another country. Here, I hear you. I mean, I just want to acknowledge, I feel like the dynamics are different of how those here in this country who have our basic needs met, there can be, I'm generalizing right now, a level of privilege and insulation that may be different from your context. I just wanted to acknowledge this. There's something happening about how this country has evolved that may be different from the context that you're from, and to say there are multiple truths here. I think that there are multiple truths. So thank you.
So you pinned trauma informed. Do you want to come back to that? What would you like to offer?
It's risky. So only with the willing, only if we're all willing to go over there. If we're not, I think we should back away slowly. The reason that I brought it up, Doris, were you going to say something?
No. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, and I want to just acknowledge that I am delicately sort of taking just a delicate foot, stepping out onto this ice. I might not put both feet on it. I might retreat from it. Something that we were talking about earlier, and the social justice movement, and my colleagues out there, some of whom may be on this call and or may watch this tape. I'm walking forward delicately to say there's a way that it's important from my perspective that we be very careful in how we talk about how we're attending to trauma, so that we do not fixate in a way that doesn't allow us to release it. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a way that you can avoid it and ignore it, and nobody wants that. And then there's a way that we can grip onto it and claim it as an identity that then limits our ability to actually be free. So this is just something I wanted to note that has come up for me in conversation with many folks lately in various parts of the field. And it feels like a somewhat taboo thing to say, which is why I'm sort of delicately putting a toe on the ice and with one foot still back in the domains that we were. And I'll pause and stop there and hope that that is of service in some helpful way.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, Sheryl, if you want to contextualize, that from the frame of compassion, how can compassion be used, right, to keep the complexity, but to keep the flow, to impede any kind of over-identification that's not helpful? How do you see the role of compassion in that?
Yeah, I actually want to invite my colleagues in, if you have thoughts first on the frame, and then I'll, yeah.
I'm with you, Sheryl. I think we have to do more than just describe what's happening. For traumatized folks, for people who are marginalized in our society, we see them a lot in healing spaces, right? Because they're naturally seeking relief from the suffering they're experiencing in the world. We see them in our therapy offices too, and I have been really influenced by Brianna French and Helen Neville and the Radical Healing Collective. They've advanced a psychological model of radical healing for people of color, and it recognizes this dialectic between acknowledging trauma and suffering and historical trauma, while giving our clients a pathway to liberation. By laying out the fact that we are not only our traumas, that there are strengths that we have cultivated as communities, and to redefine our futures by recognizing, that there are things to be joyful about. There are things that we can, grab hold of to hopefully change our future for our future generations. And leaning into that future orientation and leaning into the things we do have control over, acknowledging the things that we don't have control over, is a really important thing to be doing, to be offering hope and joy, and giving ourselves permission to feel all the things. So I would recommend reading about their work. It's been really influential and I think very, very helpful.
What she said.
What you both said.
So, I mean, I'm wondering, kind of in that context, are there, the way that compassion is defined more popularly or in the mainstream, are there aspects of compassion that have been left out, right, that need to be named here again, that need to be reiterated in the context of what Sheryl and Doris you've just shared? Yeah.
I want to say that I think what we need to be talking more about is compassionate action and behavior, and not just that good feeling we get when we feel it, right? Like that's great. And and I guess that comes to the question of, like, is this a feeling, a motivation? But can we do more than just feel it and feel connected and feel like, the desire to alleviate suffering? Can we actually do something, and really wanting to see us looking more at what gets us to do the thing, because action is hard. And there are lots of other things that get in the way of us taking compassionate action besides just feeling compassion. And I would be really curious, Rick, maybe you know more about the research on what are the predictors of compassionate behavior, not just intention.
I think definitely part of it is exactly what you said. People tend to, as an average, that's generalization, that's kind of the nature of social science research, right? What's the average? And it leaves many out. Tend to feel and express compassion more for those who are like them, or those who they judge to be innocent of the suffering that they're carrying. And so expanding, becoming more mindful of those processes inside the mind that privilege certain recipients of compassion over others is helpful. Another major factor is just to distinguish or differentiate compassion from moral judgment, approval, disapproval, liking, disliking, in-group, out-group, just to realize, oh, it's different. That's why I really appreciated the kind of way you were approaching it with Sheryl, which is native to me in my own Buddhist background, of compassion as non-referential, as kindness, compassion, lovingness broadly, including commitment to justice, pro-social motivations broadly, as a kind of radiance, kind of rippling outward. I think of it literally like a Wi-Fi base station, I guess, through which other beings flow, not contingent on who they are and whether we like them or not. You know, so that way of resting and in experiencing compassion, I think is really important. I'll just maybe end with another little bit, which is about, I think the question is thoroughly right. What is the compassionate action? And it's funny, as you know, I started meditating in 1974. The older I get, I think the calmer I get and the madder I get. I'm just freaking mad in a good way. Like, it sucks how it's been. And we just swim in that water, you know, and we go, oh, what's water? Well, it's the water we live in, patriarchy and all the rest of the last 10,000 years. And it's messed up. So it's time to do something about it at scale. And also to maybe a little bit like Cheryl's opened a space here, maybe just to be blunt. What I see a lot is kind of a newcomer to the more pro-social world of organizations, picking up on a comment I've seen in the chat from, find the name in a second here, who's pointed out that it's really curious that organizations that are motivated around wealth and power tend to be very competitive at the marketplace level, but very cooperative at the political policy level. They don't join their forces. They join their forces in corrupt ways. Most pro-social organizations are the opposite. They're really friendly at this level, but then they're incredibly territorial, and they rarely pool their money into a single bucket that's big enough to compete. You know, the oil and gas industry in America spent $2 billion over the last 15 years on blocking climate legislation, just in America, and they got what they paid for. You know, so how do we join together at this larger scale that will actually, you know, drive the systemic changes we, you know, that many of us, you know, long for?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow. Here's our next hour and a half. Yay, how amazing. So on the last thought that Rick just shared, and then I'll sort of go backwards through my notes that I was taking over here, this notion of where are we maneuvering and where are we allying at what levels in various parts of the social justice movement. This is why I'm going to plug Taj James again. And I wish I could, and the spelling of his name is T-A-J, like Taj Mahal, Taj James. And I wish I could remember the name of his new organization. I think it's Full Spectrum Labs. This is the way that he thinks. And he and his colleagues and those who are working in that universe, you know, how do we pull assets and resources at the aggregate upstream enough? How do we ally in the places that actually matter to change things at the level of DNA? Not at the level of things on the surface. Surface matters. We do need to alleviate, you know, pain is happening, but let's go upstream, right? Let's go upstream to more the source of things if we can, economically and socially. Again, for the benefit of all. This is not just for the benefit of some. This is for the benefit of everyone. The tide rises and any boat that's on it will go up. That is what it is. So that's one thought. You know, this notion of action and not just feeling and sensation. I'm so glad that you said that. So yes, the feeling is good. It's nice to have good feelings. Yes, the endorphins, all the chemicals, yay, yes. But then we don't want to get addicted to that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, this is bypassing. That's bypassing when we're like skipping and we're like, oh, I just want the good feelings. That is a form of addiction. It really is when we're fixating. So as you continue in various spiritual lineages, they say when the nyams, when the sort of spiritual experiences start to happen, your teacher says, do not attach to those things, even if it's bliss. Literally, that's an instruction. because it can block you from continuing to the deeper levels of actual realization where we can actually be of profound, limitless, boundless service. Boundless service. So it's not don't have the goodies and, oh my God, I shouldn't feel good things. It's stay present with that, because that sensation itself will arise, dwell for a while, and dissolve. That is what things do. And our job is to stay present with the totality of it, because underneath everything that's happening is goodness, pervasive, unequivocal. I think the last couple of things that I thought of when Rick was speaking, you said radiance, right? So the Tibetan word is tsal, T-S-A-L, tsal, right? You know, this radiating. So there's again, at certain parts and times in our practice, we go deep enough and that radiance is automatic. It's not contrived. We don't have to try to be compassionate or try to be helpful. We can't help ourselves. Someone is, you know, parent pushing a buggy across the street and something starts to tip or there's a car, you run. You can't help yourself. You can't help but try to be helpful. And that helpful will be more skillful the deeper we are in our practice, right? You know, there's forms of help where it's like, stop it. You are not helpful. Just back up, meditate. No. And then there's forms where it's actually skillful. This is where we're going at the deeper levels of our practice. When we show up on the scene, my teacher said a couple of months ago, you know, we're the one on the scene. How are we going to be? How are we going to show up? Whatever is going down, we're the one there. How will we show up? And deep compassion, it's unavoidable to be of assistance. You cannot help yourself because that is your joy. Other people's happiness is your exact joy. Like that is your nourishment and feeding. Like literally that's what occurs. I'm very excited. The last thing I'll say here is some of you may know that in multiple lineages, there's a range of wisdom beings. Some of them are very calm and peaceful, and some of them are other ways that we can talk about magnetizing, and some of them are very fierce and intense and have weaponry to support the liberation of everyone and everything everywhere, as one of my teachers said. Now, the only way that it is appropriate to wield that kind of wrathful weaponry is if our heart of compassion and bodhicitta is stable. Otherwise, we should go to the more gentle forms. As we are deepening our repertoire and capacity to engage compassionately with the world, we become more stable and more will be required of us. More intense situations we may need to intervene in, whether in our families, our organizations, our communities, and so on, then we will need a wider range. And we have to be extremely stable to deal with that greater intensity. This is the point at other levels of practice. It really matters. We could say a lot about this, but I want to say, because when we're talking about injustice, we need a range. I would use an F word right now. We need a range of effing weaponry that is wielded with a stable heart of bodhicitta, sometimes to arrest harm, and then to cultivate a field of goodness.
Love it. Love everything you said.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to check in. I'm just sort of noticing the time, and I know we wanted to take some questions from the audience, but I don't know, Rick or Doris, if you have any comment or insight that you wanted to share before we shift.
Just fantastic appreciation for what you said there, Sheryl.
Yeah.
I wish I could read this chat. I'm not even going to attempt it. There's too many in there. I'm not even going to try. I'll get lost in scrolling. So
You're getting lots of thumbs up and hearts, Sheryl. I think that's
okay.
a lot.
I didn't even open it.
All right. So maybe let's pause here and open it up. And I just want to invite Roshana Green, who's part of the Nalanda's leadership team, to join. I know she's been collecting a lot of the questions from the audience. And so Roshana, please let us share with us what's been going on in the Q&A and chat.
Lots of, again, mirroring what you just said, lots of hearts and love coming through for your compassionate wisdom, Sheryl, and generally folks loving this discussion. And where I'll circle back to, people were really intrigued and interested in the trauma-informed element you introduced today, Sheryl. And this is for all of you, but is there a differentiation you could speak to in being trauma informed versus taking a trauma dominated approach?
Doris, I'm looking to you.
What do I see as the difference between trauma informed and trauma dominated?
Yes, a couple folks were really wanting or feeling there needed to be maybe some differentiation or deeper discussion about the differentiation there, trauma informed versus trauma dominated approach.
I haven't heard the term trauma dominant approach. I'm not exactly sure what is meant by that, but I guess if I were to, and Sheryl, I want to hear more about what felt so fraught about introducing this as a topic. But I think that, like, as a clinician and as someone who teaches on this topic, there's a balance we want to hold between a sensitivity we want to bring to conversations about trauma, and recognizing that some people are much more vulnerable to trauma experiences, and we need to, like, approach that with sensitivity and care in how we talk about experiences and assess folks and what they're bringing into the room and all of that. And at the same time, we want to give folks, I think, tools for tolerating the distress around the trauma. And I see this a lot around the idea of trigger warnings. And I worry about avoiding things that are gonna, out of fear that we're gonna re-traumatize people, right? By talking about certain subjects, by approaching certain issues. And I think what we have more capacity to do with some of the practices and the tools is to help build people's capacity for being present with their own trauma experiences and reactions, so that they can be in that discomfort, as Sheryl started out with, talking about the kinks, to start to recognize that there are knots and kinks in our experiences, but to help us be able to open up channels, so that we're experiencing everything, including our traumas, including our joys. And so not to overly focus on trauma as our frame, but to recognize that as part of life, but to give folks tools and strategies for holding space for that, while also creating space for other kinds of experiences and identities.
You're on mute, Roshana, if you're saying anything.
I was pausing to see if there was anything additional we wanted to add there before I move on to something that feels connected. Okay. There was an ask for sharing some examples of practices to deepen our stamina and capacity to be with big emotions. Maybe, and for me, it feels relevant, as you were just speaking, Doris, building that tolerance to be with challenging things and to start to work through and tease apart some of these knots of trauma. Are there practices, examples of practices that any of you would like to share that you think would be helpful?
Doris.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I can share one thing. Hopefully this is helpful to folks. So, in my teaching of clinicians, I actually do a lot of work around relational mindfulness practices, including compassion practices, because I think that they offer so much. And so one thing that I have found to be helpful for it in the classroom and in practices is to really identify a place of stuckness in ourselves, whether it's around self-compassion. Maybe we feel a resistance to cultivating that. Maybe we feel a resistance to offering compassion to someone in our life that we have been hurt by, or feel that there's a vast cultural distance or experiential distance that we feel, and to spend some time with just kindness and curiosity to explore what gets in the way of us feeling compassion for that person, whether it's ourselves or someone else, and to recognize that that our society is structured in such a way that we are going to naturally struggle to feel compassion for some folks than others, and to sort of normalize that, to take the shame out of that, but to recognize that there are reasons why we are struggling, and to engage in some exploration around that, and then to try out a number of different practices. So for example, with my students, I actually invite them to do a loving kindness or full-on compassion practice for 2 weeks, focusing on that relationship, or focusing on themselves, and to sort of see it as an experiment, to see, can we move the needle, can we open up space, and also to cultivate a practice of active perspective taking. There's a lot of research that shows that if we even do some narrative writing around imagining what it's like to wake up in the shoes of that person, or that that someone that we're struggling with in relationship to, and to write about what it might be like to walk in their shoes for a day, that even a simple narrative writing task like that opens up spaces of compassion and greater empathy, and an ability to adopt their perspective that naturally arises, that feeling of love. So I invite them to actually see if this is something that they can cultivate, and I've just seen incredible, profound transformation happen even within just like say 3 weeks. So this is why I started off by saying I feel so hopeful about the power of these practices if we have the motivation and intention and will, and curiosity to work on this, that boundless compassion can be ours.
What you're sharing, Doris, reminds me of rain, the practice of rain, which Tara Brach has really popularized. Right, so the R standing for you recognize, right, a part of you, like you're saying, Doris, that might be blocking compassion, or that needs to be held in some way by yourself. The A is to acknowledge that, the I is to investigate it, and the N is to nurture. So rain is a wonderful practice that I often do with my clients, going along exactly with what you've shared, Doris.
Yeah. And I'll share, Rick may have some as well. I'm going to put in the chat a website. Feel free, you can reach me through there. Happy to share some subtle body practices, so non-cognitive, but actually working at the level of energy on this untangling of the knots in our system. Happy to do many things in more private, tailored small group settings with folks if you're interested.
Kind of a brief two-parter I might add is what I found definitely in myself was that it felt like there was a hole in my heart when I entered young adulthood, of all that had been missing in terms of feeling cared about or seen or included or understood or valued by others. And I think many people are walking in life with their own hole in the heart, their own sense of being undernourished, understandably, under-internalized. And I find that for many people, an important inner resource to build up, or capability to build up inner strength, is the felt sense of being cared about in a range of ways, from very mild, simple experiences of being included and seen to feeling appreciated, liked, or even loved. And there's a reparative opportunity in everyday life, including in very real but mild ways, to look for facts of those, the facts, when you are actually cared about in those 5 different ways: included, seen, appreciated, liked, or loved, and then help yourself have an experience of it that you take in, drop by drop, bit by bit, brick by brick. You fill that hole in your heart. And as people gradually, increasingly feel replenished in that way, there's a growing sense of both agency, that at least there's something I could do inside myself, which is especially important if you've been oppressed in a variety of ways and let down in a variety of ways. And you gradually build up a kind of a core, literally hardwired into the nervous system of, feeling supported with inner allies, a sense of your own worth that you can draw on, which then enables compassion, kindness, pro-social activities toward others. And as a detail about that, something I've just seen a million times, it's like the dirty little secret in psychotherapy. Large fraction of the beneficial experiences that people have, fostered by the training program or different programs of various kinds, or they generate themselves, have no lasting impact. There's no learning. They don't sink in. They skitter on to the next thing, or we just sort of assume that something will sink in. And that's why I think it's really important to turn states to traits. When people are having experiences of what they long for or what would be valuable and useful inside, slow it down for that extra breath or two or three. Feel it in the body. Be aware of what feels good about it, which are neuroplastic factors of lasting change in your body, so that increasingly you carry those traits with you wherever you go.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. The following question is coming from Janet Garsky. My apologies if that's not the proper pronunciation of her last name. If compassion is separate from moral judgment, then how can we define social justice as a goal of compassion practice? Aren't we making a moral judgment when we define social justice? For anyone who wants to touch that one.
Rick?
Well, I'm not sure. I really defer to Sheryl and Doris here. I just feel there's no escape from values. To want to transcend values, and I think in the ultimate, it's non-dual, but in the relative, to even want to not have values is a value statement. So, I value feeding children. I value standing up for people who are being mistreated. I value those things. I value the San Francisco 49ers winning in the playoffs this weekend, if they possibly might. We have values. It's okay. So I guess I'll just start there. We have to be careful about that, around selfing them and self-righteousness and all kinds of things. But I don't know if there's an escape from values. And
I totally agree. In fact, we know Buddhist ethics is a value system of behavior that we're trying to cultivate as good for ourselves and good for the world in which we live. And I think that's all social justice really is trying to give everyone equal access to the things that make us happy and safe and healthy. And so, I'm on board with that being a moral judgment, if we want to call it that. It feels like actually a compassionate value. So I'm not sure that I see that, I understand. I'm looking at your question around if compassion is separate from moral judgment. I don't know that it is separate from, I don't think it's separate from moral judgment. I think we're saying there are ways that we should be showing up for each other and ways that we shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I concur with both of my colleagues. I think, I don't know that we're saying that it's separate, and I appreciate Rick bringing in the relative and the absolute. What is possible and what's necessary at the relative level when we're learners, when we're learning into reconnecting with our natural compassionate state, we have to be very vigilant, that we are kind and gentle and generous and honest and all of the paramitas, right? All of the positive qualities. We have to be very, very attentive to that. If there are folks and beings who are at other, states of realization, their ability to display compassionate action is not at question. But for the rest of us, who are learners and who are, striving in our, confusion, moving in and out, we have to be deeply vigilant. And to Rick's point about, we have to be careful about self-righteousness. Yeah, we've got to be very careful about rigidity. And our tender heart, What is it? We're not going to do idiot compassion. We are going to be wise and thoughtful, careful and kind, but not oblivious to harm happening, so that we address what's before us appropriately for the good of all.
Wonderful note to wrap up on, right? For the good of all. Thank you for that, Sheryl. Yeah, we're at our time. It really flew
Wow.
by. Thank
It
you
did.
so much, Sheryl, Rick, and Doris, for your wisdom, your insights, your time, all the work that you've been doing all these years that brought you to this very moment now to be able to share with all of us. Yes, much appreciation. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciation, gratitude.
Rick, this is really great being with you all.
Really good.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone in the chat with all of your comments and
Yeah.
sharing of resources.
Be well, everyone. I hope this has stirred things up, gotten people, thinking, creating, wondering, sparking curiosity, and may you bring it into your day, your week, your year, and your work. And there is next Friday, same time, there will be the third and final summit gathering that will be focused on embodied practices. So please.
And you'll see me there. I'll be there.
Sheryl will be there. Joe will be there. So it'll be another wonderful discussion.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you,
Thank you.
Rick, Doris, Fiona, Roshana, Joe, Tricycle. Thank you, everyone.